So after discussing with many of you in class, I just wanted to give an overview about specifically what I'm looking for when I talk about the 4 types of evidence in your essay. So this is part of the rubric that you had received when we first started the writing process, where by the end of your essay, you should include at least one instance of each of the 4 types of evidence. So just a couple overviews about a couple points to think about when you are integrating evidence into your essay. No matter what type of evidence it is, remember to introduce your evidence in some way. So this is explaining who your evidence is coming from and explaining how your evidence is relevant to your paragraph. So for example, to introduce a piece of evidence, just really simply, I could say the American Heart Association or provides some guidelines for physical activity. These guidelines state, and then I could insert my quote. So that's just a really quick, easy way to integrate your evidence by introducing it first, by explaining who it's coming from, the American Heart Association, and then how it's relevant to your topic sentence, which is guidelines for physical activity. So the next thing that you should remember when you are citing evidence is to be mindful about your choice of quoting, paraphrasing, and summarizing. So quoting is something that most people will lean toward when they think of evidence, but as your writing becomes more sophisticated, then you can start making conscious choices of how you are integrating your evidence into your essay. So if you're quoting it, then you should be making this choice based on your desire to have the exact wording from your source inside your essay. So this is great for if the specific part of the evidence you intend to analyze is within that quote. Other times, it's totally okay to integrate your evidence using paraphrasing and summarizing. So when you paraphrase something, it's roughly about the same length as what you would be quoting, but you're putting it in your own words. So this can generally clear up some of the tense differences or missing information that might be part of your quote in terms of like just little words, but generally it's going to be about the same length. So that's a great opportunity to paraphrase if you find that the quote itself wouldn't make sense unless you changed a few things around. Then finally, summarizing is a great way to take a large passage and make it shorter. So you might consider using summary to give context for your quote that you're going to integrate. But this context might also kind of be considered part of that evidence. So you'll have to cite that as well. Which leads to this next point is that you need to always include an in-text citation at the end of your evidence, regardless of whether it's a quote, summary, or paraphrase. So this means that typically I recommend citing at the end of every sentence that's new. So if you paraphrase in one sentence, put an in-text citation at the end of that. If you quote in the next sentence, then put an in-text citation at the end of that. If all of your evidence is inside a quote and your quote is multiple sentences, then you don't need to put your in-text citation until the end of the quote. So like I said, include an in-text citation at the end of each sentence for paraphrase and summary, and include an in-text citation at the end of a quote. So having these general guidelines in mind, that brings us to the 4 types of evidence. So most people are really comfortable using factual and statistical evidence. Factual and statistical evidence is a quick way to appeal to logos. It's instantly recognizable and generally well received. People typically will look at statistics and say, oh yeah, I believe that. And then it's also easy to paraphrase facts and statistics because you can just pull a number without having to pull the huge quote that the number is part of. So, for example, of a statistic, people who keep a gun in the home are 50% more likely to be murdered in their home. So this right here is a statistic, 50%. In comparison to a fact might be the weather changes according to the seasons. So a fact is like a scientific observation that everybody agrees on, but maybe for some specialized information, you'll have to cite it from a specific source. So at this point, this would be a good time to look at your essay and label your factual and statistical evidence to make sure that those are present in your essay. So moving on, after you have labeled your factual and statistical evidence, the next piece of evidence that most people are comfortable using is anecdotal evidence. Anecdotal evidence can appeal to pathos. So if we're kind of thinking about those classical appeals, anecdotal evidence appeals to pathos because it can provide specific human examples of statistics. So it can pair really well with facts and statistics to make them more personal in order to appeal to pathos. And this gives you an opportunity to maybe take a general nebulous concept and provide a specific example that your audience will be able to grasp better. So this can include mostly and primarily individual stories and observations. So you can even use your own anecdotes in your essay if they're applicable and if you have had experience related to those issues. So for example, you could say, if you were writing about the dangers of texting and driving, one teenager who was interviewed for this essay stated, yes, I know I shouldn't text and drive, but sometimes I do it anyway. I don't think it's a big deal when you do it at a stoplight or something. So at this point, you can use this story to analyze this piece of evidence to show how even though teens know texting and driving is dangerous, they're willing to do it anyway. So in your essay, take a look, pause the video, and label your anecdotal evidence. So you're looking for examples where you are giving an individual story, either your own story or somebody else's story. And after you've taken a minute to do that, the last one that most people are really comfortable with is authoritative evidence. So when we talk about authority, we automatically think of ethos in our classical appeals. So authoritative evidence is any well-respected source, and they can often be paired with facts and statistics as well. So a authority might be an authority figure, like a singular person, or they might also be an organization. Like I'd mentioned, the American Heart Association before, they might be that authority figure. And so when you're thinking of authoritative evidence in your essay, you're going to label just one piece of authoritative evidence, even though that specific piece of evidence might overlap with your facts and statistics, or even an anecdote if an authority figure is speaking from personal experience. So when you are using authoritative evidence, it's really important to introduce the authority figure and explain why they're an authority. So for example, the American Heart Association, which manages $1 billion in grants to study cardiovascular health, recommends getting 60 minutes of activity each day to prevent heart disease. So by including this little section right here, I'm telling you why you should respect the recommendations of the American Heart Association. So that's why this appeals to authority. So take a look at your essay again and try and find an example of authoritative evidence. And then finally, this last one is logical evidence. And logical evidence also appeals to logos, but it can be harder to use than facts and statistics because it's kind of creative, where you have to make your own evidence. You may have to support your logical evidence with facts or statistics because that will make it so that it's grounded in truth. And then when you are using logical evidence, make sure that you're not using your logical evidence as analysis for a different piece of evidence. If it's really truly evidence, then you're still going to need to analyze it to connect back to your topic sentence, and then you'll still have to show how it's connected to your thesis. That's how we know that it is evidence. So there's two types of logical evidence. The first one is syllogism. So in class, we've talked about how a syllogism can look in this particular format, where we say A plus B equals C. And as long as A and B are true, then you could imply that C would also be true. This is kind of like a causal relationship. So for example, when people are paid more than minimum wage, they can support their lifestyle while working fewer hours. When people work fewer hours, they have more time to pursue creative and scientific projects. Therefore, paying people more money will lead to more creative scientific advancements. So because I have shown that the premise of A is true and the premise of B is true, then C must also be true. The second type of syllogism is kind of a classical syllogism, and this is where you have a major premise, a minor premise, and then a conclusion. Your major premise is a general statement. So plants need carbon dioxide. Then from my major premise, I take a minor premise that is specific to that. So ferns are plants. I connect back to this part here. Then my conclusion is that therefore ferns need carbon dioxide. Since I've established that all plants need carbon dioxide and all ferns are plants, therefore ferns need carbon dioxide too. It's kind of like the all squares are rectangles kind of thing. So take a look at your essay. If you don't have a syllogism yet, try and look for something that you can revise into a syllogism. And then the final part is an analogy. Now, analogies are also really great for doing analysis, but they can also be used as their own type of evidence. And this is where you have to be really careful about making sure that you have all the pieces in place. So if you are trying to compare P and Q, you have to say specifically what parts of them, what properties they have that are similar. So in respect to properties A, B, and C. Then you can say that P has a further property, maybe called X. Then you can show through logical reasoning that Q also probably has the quality of X based on the fact that it has A, B, and C. So when you're thinking about these A, B, and C and X components, in order to have a strong analogy, it's important to talk about think about the relevance of those similarities, the degree of similarity, and the amount and variety of ways that those things are similar. And I got all this information from Wikipedia, so there's my citing my source. So if you want to follow these steps, this would be a great way to just pop in an analogy into your essay. So first thing you would do is lay the groundwork for what P and Q have in common, and then discuss one quality that P has that some might think is lacking in Q, and then finally demonstrate how Q also contains the quality found in P based on the fact that they have the qualities of X, Y, and Z. So for example, if I wanted to argue that parents from poverty want their children to be just as successful in school as parents from affluent families, I could use this type of analogy. I could say, among families of poverty and wealth, parents envision their children having a bright future. All types of parents ascribe to the American dream in which their children are better off than the generation before them. So here I'm saying how all families are similar, even among parents who come from poverty and parents who come from wealth. Then I say here, I focus on a specific quality of parents of affluent backgrounds. I say, because education is one of the biggest determiners of future success, parents from affluent families often take extra measures to ensure their children are successful in school, such as hiring tutors and connecting with teachers. Then I show how families of poverty would do the same. I say, because parents of poverty also want their children to be successful, it can be inferred that parents from poverty would take the same additional measures if they had the financial means and know-how. So now look at your essay and see if you have an analogy or can build one from what you already have present in there.